Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're back with another Warhammer The Old World video. Since the more recent news of Warhammer The Old World, where we've been told about new changes and of course the rules and so on, they mentioned some units, and with that I started thinking about possible factions for the future. You see, Warhammer Fantasy Battle had a decent amount of different factions and so on, but there could always be more, especially since Games Workshop are going back to the Warhammer Fantasy world. This is the perfect time to flesh out different races and factions which never really got anything changed up. Keep in mind that in the past, there were Games Workshop developers that stated that they wanted to do a bunch of different factions in the east and in the south and so on, but they really never had time. Well, we know that the main focus was the Old World because, well, the Old World stuff sold, Empire, all the generic factions, but as I said, this is the perfect time. Now for you Total War Warhammer fans, before you think of anything, this could be something that could be linked to Total War in the future, as anything that gets added into the Old World Warhammer Fantasy universe of the tabletop would then be considered canon. Not only that, I guess that's fair game for Creative Assembly if, well, let's be honest here, Games Workshop want to use games as cross-marketing, so why not turn anything from the tabletop into DLCs? Especially since technology doesn't really change that much as the time progresses. Gunpowder units would be the same, steam tank units would be the same, and so on, so this is entirely possible. So with that, I want to jump into my top 5 most wanted factions for Warhammer The Old World. Keep in mind these are new factions and nothing that we've already seen before, though some factions which appeared in earlier editions that had 1 or 2 models or featured in other formats will make an appearance here, as, yeah, trust me, I'm gonna go very heavily into that. So let's just begin, shall we? For our 5th spot, we have Albion. The islands of Albion themselves are actually very important in Warhammer Fantasy lore. Many important magical ley lines spread throughout Albion, and not only that, but it's been the main feature of a number of campaigns in the past. Humanity also pretty much evolved from Albion too. Albion itself has always been very curious, as it was trapped in time per se. As the rest of the human cultures expanded, found their own identities, cultures, and so on, Albion stayed the same. It's because of the weirdness that comes throughout the magical ley lines. Because of this, the people of Albion haven't really evolved or, well, learnt anything from technological marvels or anything like that. Instead, they've stayed in a very druidic form. As Warhammer is obviously inspired by our own real world, many have linked it to the Celtic Britons, and it fits really well. We could have a Celtic-style army for Warhammer Fantasy through Old World. Loads of skirmishing combat units mixed around with some animals, say wolves, eagles, and stuff like that. We also know of various different beasts that may have fought alongside those of the people of Albion through some uneasy alliance or sometimes just payment. Centaurs, fen beasts, giants, and so on. So it could be like a good style beastmen army in a sense, because obviously the Celts themselves would fight in a very skirmishing combat style, so do the beastmen. You wouldn't see legions, but more focusing around, moving around, maybe ambushing your enemy, hitting them on the side for the flank and the rear. It would be kind of cool. It would be an interesting playstyle. For our 4th spot, we have Grand Cafe, and this is one of those things where we can pretty much expect them, I guess. You see, obviously, Games Workshop had to work alongside Creative Assembly to create Cafe for Warhammer 3. This has been confirmed on multiple accounts, where anything that needs to be built from the ground up needs Games Workshop's approval, and even sometimes Games Workshop working alongside of them. So Cafe at this point in the timeline would be, well, the same as before. They would just be one of those superpowers that were hidden far off in the east. Heavy use of gunpowder and monsters and magic would be expected with their own possible unique lore of magic. We're gonna have to wait and see for that, but it just seems very viable. Now, some people might be saying, well, that would be too similar to the Empire, but as it stands in the lore, given the current time frame that we have, there's no colleges of magic, meaning that the Empire would not have any access to any wizards of any kind. Instead, the Empire would be focusing more on larger armies and loads of gunfire. Of course, this is very much dependent if they decide to split up all the different provinces and give them their own unique playstyle, which would be kind of cool too. So as it stands, Cafe would probably be one of the strongest factions out there, and it would be interesting interesting to see how they play, especially if the typical stuff that we're expecting, like terracotta warriors, more serpentine dragons, monkey warriors, and so on, get implemented. I believe that there is a basis to make them quite unique, and we're going to have to wait and see how they play in Warhammer 3. The fact of the matter is, since Games Workshop was involved with the creation of Cafe, I'm of course referring to Warhammer 3 here, it would be a massive shame if all the hours that the developers put in, and here I'm referring to the Games Workshop devs, if all the hours they spent was only for Total War Warhammer 3, it would be pretty cool if we could see the designs that will eventually make it into Warhammer 3 brought to life to the miniatures too. Referencing what I said at the beginning of this video, cross-marketing, it works very well. If they have the models in-game but also in the tabletop, they'd be prone to sell more. Not everyone would buy the miniatures, but I know loads of people who got into 40k figures of, say, Dawn of War or Space Marine, so this would very much work the same way too. I know loads of people who wanted to play Warhammer Fantasy after playing Warhammer 1 or 2, so, you know, this works. This is great cross-promotion, and it would be cool to see Cafe. More human nations would be needed. Well, just more factions in general. We had a decent amount in 8th edition, but more is always best, as that way you see more on the tabletop, on tournaments, and so on. Going up to the third spot now, we have the Vampire Coast. Now, this is kind of cheating, as yes, they were a tabletop army way back in the day, a small Warhammer Fantasy supplement for 6th edition, but it wasn't really a fully fledged out army. We've only now seen the Vampire Coast and how they should be with, obviously, Warhammer 2's Curse of the Vampire Coast DLC. Now, if you've played Warhammer 2 and the Curse of the Vampire Coast DLC, you've seen the absolutely amazing job that Games Workshop and Creative Assembly worked together to create. The army just looks so radically different to other undead factions, and it's just very visually impressive, it's cool, and it presents a different playstyle. Now imagine this, you've played as the Vampire Counts, you've played as the Tomb Kings. They're very much the same with a few differences, but you want an undead horde with a lot of big monsters and a massive cannon. I mean, how cool is that? It will present for some different playstyles, especially for those who prefer to play as undead characters, or undead armies better yet said, but want some firepower, and some pretty brutal one. The framework's already there, and if everything from the Vampire Coast DLC gets into the tabletop, that's already a full complete army book. It's pretty much, yeah, it's literally a full army book. With its own unique lore of magic, and of course a unique playstyle, it will give you incentive to buy these miniatures. Again, cross-promotion, but it just fits for the playstyle of people who like black powder weaponry and stuff like that. I'm one of those myself. I like the Vampire Counts personally, I played them heavily during 6th edition and obviously 8th, but the fact is that not having any firepower kinda made things difficult for you. And I couldn't get too much into the playstyle because yes, the magic was decent and having an immovable object was also pretty good in the form of hordes, but what about something cooler? The giant Promethean crabs and so on. That would just be so awesome. For our second spot, I want to talk about the Hobgoblin cons. As you see, Hobgoblins featured heavily in Warhammer Fantasy through various editions, but they were mostly tied to either allied contingents in very early editions, or as slaves to the Chaos Dwarfs, as soon as the Chaos Dwarfs had their own army books or even expansion books. And you know, yeah, that was cool because it gave the Chaos Dwarfs some trash units and so on, whereas admittedly they were fairly decent to use, especially during 8th edition, but the Hobgoblins actually have their own Khanate. There is a pretty large Hobgoblin empire to the northern eastern parts of the world, and that never really got explored much, which is a massive shame, as it would be interesting to have a greenskin faction that wasn't really tied to the typical Orcs and Goblins faction. It's something that many people have been requesting, not just for Old World, but also for Warhammer 3, and it could present for something quite different. Many of you will remember the fast cavalry rule from 8th edition. There was a lot to do with moving around your forces in such a complicated way that you could confuse your enemy in a sense, get them through various different flanks and rear charges too. So why not if a Hobgoblin faction was focused heavily on this, and maybe a few explosions here and there? We've obviously seen the change to Hobgoblins in Age of Sigmar, and it's very likely that these will also be backward compatible. But it would be a shame if we only saw them ranked up with the Chaos Dwarfs. As standard as that is, it would be nice to have them expanded upon and given a bit more fleshed out lore. It'd be fun, it would be thematic, and, well, more factions the better, as I said. Now, before we jump onto the first spot, I do have some honorable mentions, so let's just jump into that. Napon is an island nation far off in the eastern reaches of the Warhammer fantasy world, and yes, it's a carbon copy of our own medieval Japan. Well, feudal Japan, but anything that you know about that, such as samurai, powerful navies, and so on, yep, that's all in Warhammer fantasy. In truth, that could be quite interesting to bring in an army like that, as obviously everything from Warhammer fantasy is inspired by our own real world, though they're mostly known as a naval superpower, so I'm not too sure how this could be done. In truth, the only way I actually see Napon being created is if they eventually become a DLC for Warhammer 3, as that would closely link them up there, though it's very possible that Games Workshop do have a plan to flesh out the East fully, which would be cool, as obviously, once again, more factions, always fun. Next is the Kingdoms of Ind, which is essentially, again, Warhammer India, and they were really cool because they had this whole trader vibe about them, very welcoming, and they also had some weird diplomatic negotiations when it came to certain beastmen. It could be some sort of hybrid nation between humans and beastmen, where you could then have hybrid forces. It might work out in an interesting way, kind of like mixing up the Empire with the Beastmen themselves. Two different playstyles, but mixed up together, which would make for a strange playstyle, I'd rather say, more than anything. Maybe something along the lines of specialist gameplay, so it's one of those factions that might be a while for you to get used to, but once you get used to, you'll pretty much dominate on the tabletop. Plus, we know in lore that the beastmen in question there are tiger beastmen, which sound awesome and would probably be quite fun to paint. Those stripes are going to be a bit of an issue. Maybe they could be like the Warhammer Fantasy equivalent to the 40k Harlequins, which gives me very bad painting World War II flashbacks. And lastly, for honorable mentions, I know if I don't mention these guys, you guys are going to probably try and kill me, so yeah, the Snake Men of Koresh. As far as the lore explains, the Snake Men of Koresh aren't really beastmen, but rather their own civilization, some maybe demonically infused type of beastmen in a sense? Not much is actually known about this, but a lot of people have been talking about the Snake Men of Koresh for the longest time, not just for the tabletop, but also for Warhammer 3. They could be quite cool to play, though for some reason I see them as a allied contingent of a sort for any Chaos factions, as they do closely associate themselves with Chaos. Now, they would have to get some sort of models at one point or another if Games Workshop are looking to flesh out the whole Warhammer fantasy world in Warhammer The Old World, as the lands of Koresh themselves are quite big. Just leaving that area blank is, well, yeah, just disappointing, isn't it? So here's hoping they have some sort of plan for that at the very least. But with all that being said, let's go to the number one spot of this list, which is Arabi. Okay, so hear me out. Arabi itself is a very long-standing nation within Warhammer Fantasy. Their lore goes back for hundreds if not thousands of years, and they've been involved in a lot of main events. Not only that, but they've had armies. They had an army in Warmaster, and, well, yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of lore. They're directly involved with a bunch of stuff which happens during the time of Three Emperors, which is where we're looking for Warhammer The Old World. And not only that, but it would be nice to have another army there, because they kind of act as rivals to Bretonnia, to the Tomb Kings, mostly the Tomb Kings, so it would be kind of cool to just flesh them out a little bit. Now, there are a few common misconceptions about Arabi, so let's just dive into that once and for all. Arabi itself had kinda bad lore way back in the day. Yes, there were some references to stuff that shouldn't be there, something too close to our own world, and so on, but that was all eventually changed. The lore did get rewritten. The fact that a lot of YouTubers don't mention this is kind of disappointing, because yes, they were updated heavily. There's a general misconception that Arabi is an evil race, but they are far from it. They are actually more neutral traders more than anything else, as, yeah, they just do their own thing, and are quite open with every race in the Warhammer Fantasy world, even knowing to be trading with lizardmen, and that is incredibly rare. Arabi could do with a certain rewrite in certain locations of their lore, however, you have to take into account that if they're going to be remade, then they're going to get a rewrite anyway, so I think the Games Workshop, and maybe Creative Assembly in the future, I know it sounds a bit odd considering they keep saying no, but you never know. They could do it justice and we could finally have Arabi represented. Keep in mind that Arabi wasn't written out. They've still been mentioned in Age of Sigmar, they've still been mentioned in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and both of those are very recent mentions. If they were completely out of the question, then we would not hear of them ever again, but they're still getting mentioned by Games Workshop in official canon. It's a faction that I always admired. In fact, it was one of the reasons why I purchased the Dogs of War, as the Dogs of War faction also had a few Arabi units, such as the Paymaster, Al-Muqta's Desert Dogs, and so on, so here's hoping. Now, of course, there are many different races and factions that could be added into the Warhammer Old World series, or even Warhammer Free if it comes to cross-promotion style. These are just the ones that strike out to me the most, and yes, some of you might be saying Chaos Dwarves and stuff like that, but those were official armies, and I very much expect them to be official armies in Old World once again. But what do you guys think about these picks? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel has been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.